Welcome to Public Square. This is Ditmir Bushati. My today's guest is Dr. Gangzheng, who is a tenured associate professor in the Department of International Relations and director of the Center for Overseas Security at Tsinghua University in Beijing. Gangzheng is a visiting scholar here at Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. Dear Gangzheng, welcome to Public Square.
Thank you, Mr. Bushati. It's so nice to be here.
I would like to start our conversation by asking you a question in relation to China's view of the world order nowadays. You are the first Chinese scholar that is taking part into my podcast, and I'm sure that the audience would be very much interested to hear your views about what does China think?
Mm. Okay, I think this is a very important, very fundamental question to start with. First of all, I would say that now we are facing a very fast-changing world. So people around the world, no matter they are in the East or in the West or in the global South, in every part of the world, no matter you are the decision maker or the scholars, trying to figure out what does it mean to describe the current world order or the directions it's taking. So I think in the West, as we are now in the United States, people are inventing this word as the post-Cold War, right? Because we haven't found the correct or the perfect word to describe what's actually going on, but it's definitely different from the post-Cold War period. Same thing happens in China, that we are using a relatively but similarly vague term as the war is going through a period that changes haven't been seen in a century. So in Chinese, we call it 百年未有之大变局, which means that we are experiencing all this kind of like changes that we haven't seen in a century. So this term was raised by the president Xi Jinping and is widely used. So I think this is the general ideas that we now have, that we're trying to figure out what's going on, but there has been a lot of debate going on even inside China. So for my personal understanding, I'm thinking that the most important features, or at least one of the most important features of the global order nowadays, is the asymmetric competition between the great powers, like between the United States, between China, between Russia, between the European Union, and sometimes there are also other great powers on the regional level, but they are having this kind of like a resurgence of great power competition, but in a very asymmetric way, unlike the symmetric Cold War that we experienced in the 20th century. So under this kind of like a new environment, I think all the other countries, middle powers or small countries, they are also adopting a new kind of like strategy to cope with this asymmetric competition between the great powers, which to my understanding, the most important phenomenon is the strategic hedging that almost every country is now adopting.
Here at Harvard, but also in the US in general, China is very much present. And the cooperation and the competition between the great powers such as US and China. At the General Assembly high-level meeting, President Trump was criticizing the UN and the current international order. And on the other hand, it seems to me that China is doing the opposite. So it's flagging up as the founder and protector of the global order, although we are in a way or another, all agreeing to the fact that there is a new reality, whether we call it post-Cold War order or a geopolitical recession. What is your view? Do you share my feeling that China is trying to flagging up as the protector of the current order and is trying to come up with proposals such as the Global Governance Initiative, which followed somehow the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and Global Civilization Initiative?
Yes, I think that you are right that China is now portraying itself as the protector, as the practitioner of the just international order, which is based on the UN. So this is what China claimed to do in the recent years. I think this is also it has two kind of like dimensions. One dimension is that it is a continuation of what China has been doing, or at least believe itself has been doing since the founding of the People's Republic. That is trying to kind of like to raise this banner of like, for example, the sovereignty equality between all states, and then to help the United Nations to play a central role in solving all these kind of like global challenges and regional conflicts. So this has been some kind of like a continuation in this line. But at the same time, I think what China claimed to do nowadays, or emphasize that it is doing, it is also a response to what the U.S. has been doing in the last decade, which is like under the Biden administration, it raised this term as the rule-based international order. So China will fight against this kind of like the so-called rule-based international order to say what kind of rules that it is here, right? So it is you need to be specifying kind of what kind of rules. So for China to play the UN at the center, it has kind of like a more specific point of fighting back. And at the same time, to emphasize the role of the UN, it's also to construct this kind of like a contrast with what President Trump is doing, which is withdrawing from different international institutions. So this is something that I think under this banner of like upholding the UN center based order, China has these considerations behind it. Okay. And regarding this GGI, the Global Governance Initiative, I think it is also some attempts or exploration that what China can provide to the crisis nowadays on the global scale, on the different regional levels, because we know that China raised President Xi raised this concept as you just mentioned about this security initiative, development initiative, and civilization initiative. But this kind of like three initiative, to my understanding, is like more kind of like a macro level. So I think this new GGI may be an exploration that how can you play this initiative, the former initiative, into a more kind of like a practical level that we can actually implement something. But I agree that it is still in the way of kind of like explorations.
So you're saying that it's in the process of exploration, and as far as I see, China is becoming the second biggest power in the UN in terms of budgetary support for the organization. But on the other hand, it cannot fill the gap that has been created due to the cuts from budgetary cuts from U.S. administration. What will be the effects in practice of the so-called five concepts that are enshrined by the Global Governance Initiative? What is China expecting, or what is China aiming
Mm.
at?
Okay, so I think China is doing in both ways. First, in response to the recent defund or this process of defunding from the U.S. to international organizations such as UN, the UNICEF, and other international organizations, China, I believe, from what I know, is also stepping up to provide some kind of like support, because these international organizations are in badly need for fundings, for support from other great powers. So I think China is working on this way to provide some kind of like a monetary or other kind of like support, including the staff support to these international organizations. So this is, on the one hand, this is China's, or what China is doing, and we could argue that it is two-sided efforts, because on the one hand, it definitely could support the international organizations to continue their work, but on the other hand, they also cause some kind of like criticism or suspicions that China, whether China is using this as a way to expand its power underlying its under its own like ideology or something. So this is something that also caused some kind of like debate in China nowadays, that whether China should like actively fill the gap that left by the United States. Since the US has been withdrawing so much from the international organization, whether it would be wise for China to fill all the holes that it left. So this is one thing. And on the other hand, I think China also trying to have this kind of like contribution to some challenges and problems by other platforms or other mechanisms other than this kind of like a global platforms or international organizations, such as on the bilateral level or other multilateral level. So I think in the GGIs, there are many interesting concepts out there. For example, the people-centered approach. I think this is one like a concept that raised in the GGI. I think this is kind of like a political correct phrase, right? Phrase that nobody can deny that the development or the governance should focus on the people, even the populism, which is like raging in the United States and Europe, will argue that we are fighting for the people, right? So this kind of approach could have this kind of like echoes from different political parties or coalitions. But at the same time, if you put in the details, this kind of like a notion actually emphasize what China is good at, to provide this very concrete deliveries, right, to this kind of like infrastructure or products or technological cooperations to different kind of like countries. So I think China is doing this kind of like both ways, one on this kind of global platforms, on the other hand, using this BRI or other bilateral or multilateral mechanisms to promote its version of global cooperation.
Gangzheng, here at Harvard, we are having lots of discussions and debates about two major wars that are going on. The one in the eastern part of Europe, in Ukraine, and the other one in the Middle East, in Gaza. And we know, or at least I know very well, what is the position of Europeans, what is the position of US, where is Russia standing, and what are the Russia's ambitions. But there is a small screen about the China's view about these two critical wars that are going on. I know that you are a specialist on Middle East. And I would like to have your take about China's role in the Middle East and also in Ukraine.
Okay, so I think this is also the puzzling question for the decision makers in Beijing nowadays. These two ongoing conflicts in both Europe and in the Middle East. So I think first of all, I would like to say that there are two kind of like voices, or two kind of like extremes that we often hear in this international arena. One is to downplay China's role, to say that, oh, these wars in Europe or in the Middle East shows the limits of China. China didn't have any kind of a real role to play in this kind of like conflicts. It just like shows that China is still a transactional power, blah blah blah, like this. Okay. And the other extreme is to overemphasize China's like role, to say that if China do something, it will like solve the problem overnight, right? If you hear the speech of President Zelensky of Ukraine in the UN this time, it says that without China, Russia under Putin is nothing, and then if China wants, it can stop the war overnight, something like that. So I think this kind of like two voices didn't show this kind of it reflects some kind of like a complicity of China's role in the conflicts in both Europe and in the Middle East. But I think these two kind of like voices don't have full pictures to show China what China is doing or what concerns China in their response to these conflicts. So first of all, regarding the conflict in the Middle East, so to my understanding, I think China, the focus of China's diplomacy in the Middle East is not to supplement the United States, not to confront and replace the United States. So it has this kind of like a more detached stance in this kind of like a conflicts. So because someone will argue that China's goal is to replace the United States, so it should help Iran. Or others would say, okay, China's role should maintain the security structure in the Middle East, so it should help the United States to confront other revisionist power. So I think these two kind of like narratives like misunderstand China's this approach. China's approach is kind of like more focused on the development on the region. So all those powers who doesn't put development as its priority lead on the region, it's not on the this kind of like a priority of the list of China's cooperation. So to my understanding, China's efforts in the last few years has been strengthening its relations more with the GCC countries or North African countries, which has development as its priority. And for example, Iran and Israel, although they didn't have any similarities in the regime type or in the societies, in China's eyes, they are in this kind of like a not so developmental mode. So China has little interest to vastly invested into this kind of like countries. So in this line, we can see that what China really care is that if the United States could play a positive role to like to put a stop on the regional conflicts, that would be great. Other than that, China didn't have like too much interest to just to replace the U.S. role in mediating the so-called Israel-Palestine conflicts. I think the same thing applies to the Ukrainian crisis as well. China definitely the relations between China and Russia has been a very important issue in the nowadays discussions between China and Europe. But what I understand is that even without the issue of China's relations with Russia, there are still many kind of like problems between or questions between China and Europe. So I don't think it would be wise to overly emphasize this kind of like relations. So I think more importantly, it is better to find a solution first for the ceasefire and for a long-lasting political solution.
And within the context of what we have discussed so far about China's role in protecting the global order and China's coming up with different initiatives, how does China sees the application of international law in the case of Ukraine and in the case of what's going on in the Middle East?
So this is also a very good point. So I think for China's understanding of the international law or international norm also has this kind of like two sides. It's not just like a one side story as some people who argue in Washington that you need to be a status quo power, you need to side with the U.S., and then you will be upholding the international law or international norms. So for China, understand in this way that on the one hand, there are some principles that you need to uphold, but on the other hand, there are some root cause that you also need to deal with. You cannot just sit there and say, okay, because there is international law to say that, oh, we should, for example, protect the sovereignty of every country. We should protect the sea lane security of the Red Sea, for example. So we should just do what was interpreted by Washington or was interpreted by Brussels. So China understands that yes, these are very important principles. We need to protect the sovereignty, the territorial integrity of countries. We need to protect the sea lane security of the international trade route. But at the same time, if you don't solve some fundamental concerns of like respective powers for some kind of like a regional security stakeholders, there's no way that you can have a long-lasting guarantee on these principles. So you need to think about whether the expansion of NATO has some kind of like a negative impact on this kind of like security concerns of the Russians. You need to have some kind of like solutions about the Israel-Palestine conflict in the process when solving these Red Sea security issues.
And speaking about alliances and also what you call the symmetric competition, are we witnessing the formation of new alliances and the shift from G7 to C3? I'm having in mind here the meetings of China with Russia and India. And I want also to have your take on what China and Russia called unlimited partnership when they have been speaking about unlimited partnership. What does this mean?
Mm. Okay, so first about this question about the G7 and the new partnership between China, Russia, India, for example. First of all, I think that definitely China, India is on the rise. And also Russian is arguably have this kind of like a resurgence trying to reclaim its role as the great power under President Putin. But I think that China doesn't have this kind of like full investment into this so-called new alliances or this kind of like partnership. So to me, I think this is more like the alliances of convenience, or at least as China puts it, as in fighting against the hegemony of the West, that these three countries or some other countries have some shared interest. That doesn't mean that China fully support or believe in whatever Russia or India do in international arena. So this is something that I think it is very important to understand as the foundation. I think that the G7, their relatively power in the global politics is in decline, but I won't bet on the dissolution of this G7 groups. I don't think there will be kind of like a rapid decline of the US hegemony or the Western alliances. I don't believe in that. And I don't think that the Beijing will believe in such fast track. But I think that in dealing with the pressure from the West, in pressure from Washington in particular, like all these three countries have some common ground. And the combination of these three countries has a very interesting very interesting combination because India is kind of like a more like a pro-West. It has more robust relations with the West. But Russia is nowadays more kind of like an anti-West, so it has a very bad relations with Europe and some very difficult relations with the US at the same time. So I think China is in the middle. So China can play the role to use India or Russia against one another when one side raise some kind of like inappropriate like a request. So China would say that, for example, when Russia say we should have our own kind of like a currency to fight against the dominance of the US dollars, and then definitely India would not be okay with such like a proposal. Then China would say that we should consider the ideas from New Delhi and should not just like rush to this kind of like a new confrontational aspects. But at the same time, when India has some kind of like new proposals which China don't think it is fit to its own interest, it can also use Russia as this kind of like counterbalance in this kind of like a new developmental groups or at the BRICS or in SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organizations. So this is something that I can tell from my own understanding.
Gangzheng, it's quite obvious to me that we are moving towards a power-based order. I mean, you have been speaking about asymmetric competition. I can label it as a power-based order. Maybe it has always been so, but now it's to my eyes at least it's more pronounced. But there are some areas where global cooperation is very much needed, and the position of major powers such as US, China, European Union, Russia, and other middle powers, it's necessary. My last question to you is: how do you see this cooperation, especially when we are somehow faced with technological race, and this is becoming more and more important, and also the climate change. In into these respects, what is the position of China vis-a-vis the other major powers?
Mm. Okay. So first of all, I think that that's definitely correct that the world is now marching towards some kind of like a power-based competition. But I think, to my understanding, it will be at least in one way different from the great power competition in the previous times in the history, in the European history, in the global history that we had witnessed in the past. That means that in the new international politics, I think the middle powers or the small powers, they will have actually more saying the power of discourse in the process. Why? Because all these great powers, although they try to drag different countries into their own bloc, into their own camp, but due to the comparative advantage of these great powers, all the other powers, all the other countries, like middle powers or small countries, they can actually use this strategic hedging to maximize their own national interests. They could tell Washington that if you don't give us enough benefits, I will turn to Beijing, I will turn to Moscow, I will turn to Brussels, right? And they can say the same thing to Beijing, to New Delhi, to Moscow as well. So I think in this sense, that all these kind of like the middle powers or the small countries, they are relentlessly using this strategic hedging or this fence-sitting strategy to maximize their national interest as well. And the great powers also need to take a very, very careful stance in dealing with all these kind of like countries. So in this sense, I would say that there's this new asymmetric competition doesn't mean to rule out the participation of middle powers or small countries in the discussions such as AI, such as the climate change. In contrast, I will argue that countries across the world, including countries like Albania and other European countries, they will actually have some kind of like more sayings perhaps in the discussions, because both China and the United States, for example, in the competition for AI or other technology, they need cooperation from all the other countries. So they need to consider the ideas, the voice of all the other countries to have a better competition advantage in the markets, in the cooperations across the world in different kinds of regions. And regarding the climate change, and I think that there's definitely more cooperative like a room between China and the Europeans, because compared to what the United States has done in the last decade, which has swinging from one end to another, so I think the Europeans has shown much more consistency in the climate change issues, and this is something that China has also been working on in the same line, although there has been some disputes on how to define the role or responsibility of our each parties. But I think that basically speaking, China and the Europeans are on the same line, on the same page towards one common goal. And this, in the long run, will possibly bring the United States back to the table, possibly.
Dear Gangzheng, it was a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.